Hello everyone, welcome to my articulation guide for 1/6 scale action figures. This is going to be an updated version. In a previous video I had covered three of the figures that you're going to see today, basically the original design for G.I. Joe from the 1960s, the classic collection that you see over here, and then back there is the super articulated version of G.I. Joe. But I wanted to do something a little bit more definitive in terms of covering some of the other kinds of G.I. Joe bodies and also some of the other manufacturers that are out there producing things or had produced stuff in the past. So I'm going to cover 8 figures altogether, and I'm going to show you a couple other variants also in terms of variants of these particular figures. Hopefully this will be a more definitive guide, and we'll cover pretty much most of the figures that I'm going to talk about on my channel. This may change at some point. I may acquire 1/6 scale figures that have articulation that's different from these. But for now, this video should actually cover, I'm going to say 99% of what I'm going to talk about on my channel in terms of 1/6 scale figures. So if there is something different, I'll make sure to cover it in the specific video where I'm talking about that figure. So what we're going to talk about here, there are 5 of these that are produced by Hasbro, or derivative of ones that were produced by Hasbro. So this front row are all G.I. Joe style figures, and that super articulated one is also a G.I. Joe. And then these 3 in the back are from 21st Century Toys, M&C, which makes the World Peacekeepers or Power Team, and then back there I have a BBI figure. So we're going to go through each of these one by one, and hopefully this video will be informative and helpful for you to identify what kind of figure you have in your collection or what kind of figures you want to add to your collection going forward. So let's get started. Okay, so the first figure we're going to talk about is the original 1960s style G.I. Joe. And the example that I'm showing you today is a 40th anniversary reissue of that style of G.I. Joe. But the articulation on this one is pretty much identical to the original 1960s version. So at the head, he gets back and forth like this, and then also rotation from side to side. Very good articulation at the head on these original G.I. Joes. I actually think this is one of the better ones in terms of neck articulation. And this figure is held together with elastic bands. There's a piece of elastic that hooks to the 2 shoulder joints, and then also there's a separate piece of elastic that hooks from the neck post down to the 2 hip joints. So that's how this figure is held together. At the shoulder, he can extend out like this, and also gets a 360-degree rotation at the shoulder. At the bicep, there's a swivel joint like this. At the elbow, he gets bending back and forth like this. So pretty good extension upward at the elbow. At the wrist, there's bending back and forth like this, and it also has a pivot joint there. So very good on the wrist as well. At the waist, there's a side-to-side movement like this, front and back, and also rotation. At the hip, he can kick out, kick forward, kick back, and also there's a lot of thigh rotation as well. As you can see, there's a ball joint right here, so there's a lot of sort of rotation and movement because of the use of elastic. There's actually a lot of mobility actually at the hip joint. At the knee, there's a bend like this. And then at the ankle, he gets bending back and forth like this, and also rotation. So very good articulation on the original G.I. Joe. Quite innovative for the time period, 1964, to be able to have an action figure from that time period with this level of articulation was actually excellent. And then in the 1970s, they introduced a couple of new features. One of the features that they introduced was the what they call the Kung Fu grip. And this was actually used in England, which was called gripping hands. So this is one innovation. And they also did the flocked heads when they introduced the adventure team. So this next figure is the next one we're going to talk about. And as you can see, it's much bulkier and beefier looking than the original 1960s G.I. Joe. This is generally referred to as the muscle body. The beefing up of G.I. Joe was due to the competition. Figures like Big Jim that had been introduced to the perception of the buying audience. He looked more muscular than G.I. Joe, even though he was smaller in stature. So in order to keep up with the competition, Hasbro felt it necessary to kind of make G.I. Joe a lot more muscular and sort of change the articulation quite a bit. So this is significantly different in terms of the articulation from the original 1960s G.I. Joe. You'll notice at the neck post, he actually has the swivel joint up here. So it actually acts like a ball joint. So he gets like full range of motion, back and forth, side to side, and swivel at the head. So pretty good articulation at the neck on this figure. At the shoulder, he can extend out. Also gets 360-degree rotation. At the elbow, not quite as good as articulation as on the original G.I. Joe, but he does get a bend and also a swivel there. At the wrist, it's pretty similar to the original G.I. Joe. As you can see, you can bend back and forth, and there's also a rotation there. And as you can see, he's got the Kung Fu grip hands, so obviously able to hold on to weapons and gear much better than the original G.I. Joe. At the waist, he's got some side-to-side movement, back and forth, and also a pivot. And interesting, this particular version of this muscle body is produced by Estrella. You can see the markings on the back of this. So this one was actually produced in Brazil, but the articulation on this figure is very much the same as the original muscle body produced by Hasbro. At the hip, he can kick out, kick forward, kick back a little bit. He also gets thigh rotation there. You can see a lot of side-to-side movement. At the knee, he gets a bend, and also there's rotation there just below the knee. You can see from side to side. And then at the feet, he gets bending back and forth like this, and also a rotation. So decent articulation. It's not quite as good as the original G.I. Joe, but if you are looking for a figure that's a little bit more muscular, this one might actually be well suited to that. Now, speaking of muscular, the next one we're going to talk about is the Hall of Fame style G.I. Joe. And as you can see, they really went over the top in terms of the bulkiness of G.I. Joe in this time period. So these figures, these kind of figures, were released basically beginning in the 1990s, mid-1990s. And the one I'm showing you right now is marked as Hasbro International, 1996. So this one was actually, I think, part of the Action Man line. And this one I'm showing you right now very likely came from one of my Star Wars figures where I did an upgrade. And this particular one I pulled out of my junk pile, basically, because this is not a figure that I generally use in my collection too much. I still have a few examples of it, but generally speaking, I purged most of the Hall of Fame style bodies from my 12-inch collection, just because I don't really like the design of the figure, and the articulation is not very good either. So on this one, I've actually swapped on a Classic Collection style head. So at the neck joint, there's just a pivot there. There's no other articulation there. At the shoulder, he can extend out. Also gets 360-degree rotation. The joints on this move kind of stiffly, so it's actually kind of difficult to do the articulation. But the one thing I will say for Hall of Fame style bodies, they are quite durable. So I'm guessing it would be pretty difficult to actually break one of these figures. As you can see at the elbow, he's got bending back and forth, and there's also a bicep swivel. So you get fairly decent articulation, but again, because of the bulkiness of it, when this figure's wearing clothing, he has a much more restricted kind of movement by comparison to the original G.I. Joe. At the wrist, he gets bending back and forth and also rotation. And there's quite a few examples of this particular body style where there is no articulation at the wrist at all. It's actually one solid molded piece, usually rubberized from the elbow all the way down to the hand. So no articulation on the waist at this point. There are figures that I can show you that have better articulation at the head and also at the waist. I'll show you one of those real quickly. So I have an example of it. This particular one is, I believe, from the 30th anniversary line of G.I. Joes, and I actually upgraded this particular example with Classic Collection arms and legs. But I wanted to show you the articulation on the head on this. So as you can see, this is kind of on a ball joint, similar to the muscle body figure. So he gets some side to side, front and back, and also rotation. So pretty decent articulation at the head on this figure by comparison to this one. This one also has a movement at the waist. As you can see, it gets side to side, front and back, and also rotation. And I can show you the date on this one. This one is a little bit earlier, so you can see the date on this one is 1994. So yeah, a couple years prior to this one. But like I mentioned, I've upgraded the arms and legs on this figure, so this isn't necessarily the best example to show you in terms of the articulation on the arms and legs. So typically the articulation on the legs of the Hall of Fame figures is not very good. You do get decent articulation at the hip. He can extend out, extend forward, extend back a little bit. But there's just a single joint at the knee, bending like this, and a single joint at the ankle. So almost like a Migo figure, but the difference between this and a Migo figure is there is no side-to-side movement, so either at the hip or at the ankle. In my experience, I haven't really encountered any Hall of Fame style figures that have side-to-side movement at the legs. If you have any of those in your collection, let me know in the comments. I've just never encountered any where I'm satisfied with the articulation on the legs. So again, I don't really have too many of these figures in my collection. This is the one that is in a bin of stuff that I don't really use too much for my collection. I saved it, and it comes in handy for an articulation guide like this, but again, it's not the type of figure that I typically collect. And most of the Star Wars figures that I have in my collection that use this style body, I've upgraded to classic collection style articulation, just because it's so much better in terms of the movement, particularly in the legs. You'll notice if you've seen my review of the electronic 12-inch Boba Fett action figure, the articulation on that figure is pretty similar to this one. He's the one who has electronics in the torso, so he is very much like this one in that there is no waist articulation on the figure. So around the same time period, 1996 or so, they introduced the classic collection style body, which is the next one I'm going to show you. This was much improvement over the Hall of Fame style body, just in terms of articulation and generally speaking, the overall look of the figure. It's much more in keeping with the proportions of the original G.I. Joe. So at the neck, he gets bending back and forth like this, and also a pivot joint here. So pretty decent articulation. Again, not quite as good as the original vintage G.I. Joe, but pretty decent. And then at the shoulder, you can extend out. Also gets 360-degree rotation. At the elbow, he gets a bend and also pivot back and forth like this. At the wrist, he gets bending back and forth and also rotation. At the waist, not quite as good. Basically, he gets a little bit of side to side, front and back, but it's mostly a swivel. There's not really too much in terms of being able to move other than swiveling from side to side. At the hip, he can kick out, kick forward, kick back. At the knee, he gets a bend, and there's also a pivot point there at the knee, so that's very good. At the ankle, he gets bending back and forth, and also rotation from side to side. So much improvement over the Hall of Fame style G.I. Joe. And again, just in terms of the overall proportions, much more in keeping with the original vintage style G.I. Joe. So a lot of the clothing can be interchanged between classic collection G.I. Joes and original vintage G.I. Joes because of those similar proportions. So as the classic collection line of figures progressed, they started to get a lot of competition from other 1/6 scale manufacturers who were doing figures with super articulation. So at some point, Hasbro introduced their super articulated version of the classic collection body, which is this one right here. And so this is a pretty interesting figure. And the one downside to this particular figure is over time, the joints have a tendency to get a little weak. So you end up with what they call ragdoll syndrome, where the thing becomes very floppy. This one that I'm showing you today has not reached that point yet, which is quite nice. It really comes down to the conditions that they're held in, and also how much they're being articulated over time, whether or not they will actually wear out. So let's go over the articulation on this one. So at the neck joint, it's pretty similar to the original classic collection G.I. Joe. You get back and forth. You also get some side to side like this, and also a rotation. So pretty good articulation at the head. At the shoulder, you can extend out like this, and also gets 360-degree rotation. At the bicep, there's a swivel joint right here, just above the elbow. And then at the elbow, it's double jointed, so he can extend way up with the arm. So that's really fantastic. And then at the wrist, I'm going to show you, this is the Gung Ho grip, which I believe was introduced just prior to the introduction of the super articulated body. So the articulation goes like this on the wrist here, and also rotation. And then there's articulation at the fingers. You get these three fingers actually articulate separately from the trigger finger. This allows you to put this particular finger through the trigger of a weapon if you want to. So that's very cool. These hands are very much designed in mind for holding weapons, so that's quite interesting. On this side, the articulation is back and forth like this, and also a pivot. So these gung-ho grip hands were a pretty cool innovation at the time. And there's one other style that I'd like to show you. I actually have a spring-loaded version of gung-ho grip in my collection. I only have one figure that includes this, but as you can see, there's a spring inside of there that allows it to grip very tightly. So pretty cool aspect to that. Again, they only used it on a limited number of figures. And I only have one of them in my collection that's actually like this. But very cool design for a hand, and I'd like to be able to pick up some more of these at some point if I could find them. Then at the waist, there's actually 2 points of articulation because you have at the mid-torso, you get a pivot point here. So you get some side-to-side movement, front and back, and also pivot. And then at the waist, there's also an articulation point there too. So you get rotation, side to side, and front and back there too. So this allows you to do a lot of sort of like unique movements at the torso on this particular figure. At the hip, he can kick out, kick forward, kick back, and then right here you got a thigh swivel, so you can go from side to side there. And then at the knee, you get a double jointed knee, so that allows you to bend very far back with the knee. And then at the ankle, you get bending back and forth, and also side to side pivot. So an interesting thing, the size of the feet on this particular figure is significantly smaller than on the classic collection. So you can see much smaller. So it is very easy to take boots on and off of this particular figure just because they reduced the size of the foot. So the next figure we're going to talk about is from 21st Century Toys. And this is their Super Soldier body, which was introduced after their initial run of producing figures, which are very much similar in articulation to the classic collection. So they made this modification to a much more unique kind of style of body, and had a lot more articulation than their original design. So and as you can see, this one's actually sporting a G.I. Joe head sculpt, which I've swapped onto that neck post. Generally speaking, the neck posts on the 21st Century figures are pretty similar to classic collection. There is some variation among them. I actually have one style of figure here, which has almost like a ball kind of attachment. And I believe they introduced this one so they could make head swaps possible. They would include multiple head sculpts in the set. And but in terms of it being better than the original one, I don't think so, because it only actually goes back and forth like this. You don't really get as much of a full range of motion on this particular neck attachment point. So, but you will find quite a bit of variation among the various figures. This is the most common one though, and in terms of the articulation on the neck, you can see it's on a full ball joint, so you actually get quite a bit of rotation back and forth, side to side, and so forth, movement at the head on this figure. At the shoulder, he can extend out quite a bit. Also got 360-degree rotation there, and also there's a bicep swivel, you can see right there. Also double jointed at the elbow, so as you can see, it gets a really good bend there at the elbow. In terms of the wrist, it's pretty similar to classic collection style. You get a rotation and then bending back and forth like that. At the torso, it's similar. You get several points of articulation. You get a mid-torso split right here. So again, you can get side to side, front and back, and also rotation there. And at the waist, there's also a point of articulation there. So you get some rotation, front and back movement as well. So quite a bit of ability to sort of flex the body at the torso of this particular figure. At the hip, he can kick out, kick forward, kick back. There's also a thigh split right here, so you get rotation there. At the knee, it's also double jointed, so you get to extend far back with the knee. And then at the foot, you also get articulation, bending back and forth like this, and also rotation. So pretty similar in many ways to the super articulated G.I. Joe body. And I'm pretty sure this one came first. So in terms of the competition, Hasbro was sort of responding to what was becoming available in terms of other kinds of articulated bodies. So their response was the super articulated body. So the next figure I want to show you is actually from Power Team. MNC basically is a company that made these. and they were sold as Power Team, also World Peacekeepers. And, they did this heavily articulated body, and they came up with some pretty decent head sculpts too. This is probably my favorite of all the ones that I have in my collection of the World Peacekeeper head sculpts. They did a very good job with this one. And in terms of the neck articulation here, this is probably the weak point of the Power Team figures. They just don't have a ton of articulation. It is at a ball joint, so you do get side to side, front and back, and also rotation, but the range of movement is pretty limited. So that is definitely the weakest point of this particular figure. At the shoulder, you can extend out like this. Also gets 360-degree rotation there. At the bicep, there's a swivel point right there, as you can see. At the elbow, he gets a double jointed elbow, so you can see he can bend quite a bit there. Also, at this point in the elbow joint, there's also a point of rotation right there. So that operates independently from the wrist rotation. In terms of the wrist, he gets bending back and forth at the wrist, and also rotation. And this is one of the unique ones that actually has the wrist articulation. In a lot of cases, Power Team figures come with gloved hands, very much like this one, which eliminates the bending back and forth at the wrist. So if you can find a Power Team figure that actually has the non-gloved hands, I would highly recommend picking up these in particular. It's very easy to swap out the hands on a Power Team figure as well. They pretty much pop out of there without having to do any boiling or anything like that. So these figures are very easy to sort of customize. At the waist, again, he's got the split at the mid-torso, so you get side-to-side movement like this, front and back, and also rotation. And again, another point of articulation at the waist. So he gets a swivel point there, front and back, and also side to side. So again, pretty good range of motion on this figure, very much like the super articulated G.I. Joe, and also the 21st century figure as well. So at the hip, he can kick out, kick forward, kick back. There's a thigh rotation right here. So as you can see, that swivels back and forth. Double jointed knee, you can bend very far back with the knee. And then single joint here. And also just at this point, right below the knee joint, there's also a rotation point there as well, which allows you to swivel back and forth and reposition the feet like that, independent from the hip joint. Very good articulation on these. I'm a big fan of the Power Team figures. The only downside to them is the arms are a little short, and also the neck articulation is somewhat limited. But overall, a pretty decent figure. And the last one I want to show you today is from BBI. So this is actually a fighter pilot figure that I picked up a while back. And unfortunately, this figure has gloved hands, so I can't really speak to what the articulation is like on the BBI, hands that have wrist articulation. I assume there are some. In fact, I'm almost positive there are, and I assume that they're probably pretty similar to some of the other ones that I've shown you. But this figure has some unique articulation aspects, so I wanted to show you this one. At the neck, he gets bending back and forth, so quite a bit of articulation there. You see side to side, back and forth, and also pivot. I really like the articulation on this. Quite a good range of motion on that. At the shoulder, he can extend upward like this. Also gets 360-degree rotation. At the bicep, he gets a bicep swivel right there. And then also double jointed at the elbow. You can see gets pretty good range of motion there. So that's very cool. And again, just gloved hands on this one. So just a single point rotation articulation there. At the torso, he gets side to side, back and forth, and rotation there. Also, just a single point of rotation at the waist, no side to side or anything like that there. At the hip, he can kick out, kick forward, kick back, and then double jointed knee, just like that. There's also a thigh rotation there, so you get articulation like that. And then at the ankle, bending back and forth like this, and also rotation. These feet are also quite small, very much like the super articulated G.I. Joe figure that I showed you. So this allows for the easy removal and swapping out of boots. The size of the foot is quite a bit smaller than certain other kinds of action figures. So these are all the sort of male action figures that I have in my collection. I may do a separate video at some point covering the articulation on certain female action figures that I have that are 1/6 scale, but this is all I'm going to cover today. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos about 12-inch action figures, think about subscribing to my channel because I will be covering a lot more of this kind of stuff in future videos. Until next time, I hope you're having a great day, and thanks for watching.